She was sent as a mockery, a male bride sent to the Wild West, to be the laughingstock of a man she had never met. But when she met the cowboy's quiet, warm gaze, something in her heart began to change. If one day life brings you to a place you never wanted to go, a place where there is only silence, wind, and a stranger willing to sacrifice everything to keep you, will you choose to stay or turn your back on the seemingly glorious but painful past? Sometimes what we think is a joke turns out to be the beginning of a miracle, and sometimes a person's silence is the sweetest voice our heart has ever heard. Have you ever wondered, can true love blossom from what seems like a mistake? Join me as I walk you through that story where a woman is sent away to be ridiculed, but is saved by the love she least expected. If you believe that love can heal, please like, share, and subscribe to the channel to start this story together. A winter wind swept through the cobblestone streets of New York in 1888, so cold that one could hear the metal rattle of horse-drawn carriages. On Madison Avenue, the gaslights reflected off the thin layer of snow, sparkling like falling stars. On the second floor of the Hale house, one light was still burning. Eleanor Hale sat by the window, her hands lightly touching the unsent wedding invitation. Her wine-colored velvet dress clung to her body, but it was not enough to keep her warm. In the mirror, her 32-year-old face was still beautiful, but there was a look of weariness. Her gray eyes looked out onto the street where lovers were hurrying to avoid the snow. She had dreamed of such a life. Now, all that remained was the cold room and the ticking clock. Downstairs, her mother, Margaret Hale, said, her voice as sharp as a knife on glass, "You know, Eleanor, people are laughing at me today, laughing at you, because this house has a daughter over 30 and still unmarried." Eleanor put down her teacup, her voice calm. "I don't think marriage is a measure of worth." "Mother." Margaret laughed. A hollow laugh, I don't think, because I don't understand. In New York, people live by honor, not by the poems in my diary. The air was thick. The mother was cold. The son was silent. There was only the sound of the wind and the crackling of the fire in the fireplace. That night, they had guests, a small, upper-class party. Harold Whitby, Eleanor's betrothed, showed up with his new bride. As the music played, Eleanor felt dozens of eyes on her. Someone whispered, "They say Mr." Whitby chose a girl who could laugh over a statue, who could read. The words were like a knife to the heart. Eleanor smiled, but her heart was broken. After the party, Margaret came to her son and said coldly, "You see, they were right. You have no place here. Maybe I should send you somewhere far away." The words seemed fateful. A week later, Eleanor received a thick envelope marked Western Union Matrimonial Agency. Inside was a marriage contract sent from Wyoming Territory. The man, Caleb Rivers, 45, a veteran of the West, was looking for an honest and patient partner in the wilderness. Margaret smiled faintly as she read aloud. How fitting. A spinster and a crippled soldier. A perfect match. Eleanor stood still. She had two choices: continue to be the laughingstock of New York, or leave. Leave the place that had swallowed her faith, she said softly, as if to herself. If life wants to laugh at me, I will let them laugh at me. That night, she packed her suitcase. She took only a few books, her father's scarf, and a small diary. Outside the window, snow began to fall heavily. In the dim light, she wrote the first line. "Tomorrow, I will leave. I don't know what's there, but I know that New York is no longer home." The next morning, Grand Central Terminal was covered in white frost. Train cars stretched like steel threads through the snow. Passengers jostled, but Eleanor found nothing but silence. An old man helped her lift her luggage into the car. "Is it far?" "Miss, very far," she said. "Farther than I ever believed." As the train pulled away, the metal scraped against the rails, rhythmic and dull. She sat by the window, watching the skyscrapers recede into gray blurs. On her lap lay the unopened envelope, the marriage contract. His name appeared in shaky ink: Caleb Rivers, Rivers Bend Ranch, Wind River Valley, Wyoming Territory. She closed her eyes, imagining the man, his sunburnt skin, rough hands, his frank eyes. Part of her was afraid, and part of her felt strangely relieved. In the crackling of the engine's embers, Eleanor felt as if she could hear her own heartbeat faint, but still alive. A tear fell onto the diary page, staining the words she had just added. "If there is a place to start over, I hope the western wind is strong enough to sweep away the past." The train left New York State, heading towards a strange land. In the gray sky, flocks of crows flew against the wind, just like the fragile will of the woman who had just left the city. Eleanor clutched the ticket tightly in her hand. "I'm not running away. Mom," she whispered again, "I'm just looking for a place where I can breathe." The Wyoming Territory sun rose slowly, glowing red like a trail of embers sliding down the Wind River Mountains. The air was dry and cold. The valley was covered in a fog so thick that the horses exhaled white smoke. At the end of the dirt road, a middle-aged man leaned against a wooden fence, looking out at the brown pasture. Caleb Rivers was up before dawn, a habit he had followed for 15 years since leaving the Army. The old wound in his left shoulder still ached whenever the wind shifted, preventing him from sleeping any more. He pulled on his leather gloves, pulled open the stable door, and let Shadow, the black horse, step out. The animal rubbed its muzzle against his shoulder, a reminder that a new day had begun. The Rivers Bend farmhouse wasn't big, a 2-room log house, a small stable, and a shallow well in the middle of the yard. Caleb lived there with his old dog, Boone, a collie shepherd mix, dark gray, with eyes as kind as ashes. He didn't talk much to people, but he talked to Boone like a true companion. "Do you think she'll come?" Boone Caleb asked, his voice hoarse from the tobacco and the wind. The dog just tilted its head, letting out a breath that sounded like laughter. He sat down on the steps and pulled out an old folded piece of paper from his pocket, a letter he had sent to the St. Louis marriage agency. He had written it at night, drunk. "I want someone who can keep quiet when the wind blows, who can sit by the fire and not say a word." He didn't expect a reply, but 2 months later, a young secretary sent back a message. "A lady from New York. Eleanor Hale has agreed to come to Wyoming in response to your letter." Caleb didn't know what he felt. Hope, fear. Maybe both. He'd lost too much to believe anyone could stay. Over the past few days, he had cleaned the house, patched the curtains, and scrubbed the wooden floors until his hands were cracked. He had taken the chairs out into the yard and polished the tin teapot. In the corner, he had kept the wool blanket his mother had knitted 10 years before. The smell of the old wool and the smoke from the kitchen reminded him of evenings with his ex-wife, Martha, who had died with their little girl, Lucy. The memory was still like a knife in his heart. At noon, the young postman, Henry Boyd, rode up with a telegram in his hand. Caleb wiped his hands on his trousers and took it. It read briefly, "Passenger Eleanor Hale, train number 8 arriving at Sage Creek Station, January 17th, late afternoon." Caleb folded the telegram and looked up at the sky. "A blizzard is coming," he whispered. Henry smiled. "She must be very brave to go so far," Caleb replied, "or she has nowhere else to go." That afternoon, he closed the fence and checked the horses, pulling the carriage. In his hand, he held a large woolen coat, the one he intended to give to the strange bride. He did not know what he was preparing for a companion or another memory that would leave. The next day the storm did come. The sky was leaden. The wind howled through the canyons. Snow drifted down the valley, blanketing it in white. But Caleb donned his leather jacket, scarf, and wide-brimmed hat and climbed into the wagon. Boone followed. He had to get to the station before the 8 train arrived. The road to Sage Creek Station was more than 10 miles long. Each tire crunched through the snow with a dry crunch. The wind whipped at his face, stinging his eyes. Every now and then, he bowed his head and whispered, "One trip. Just get there." When he reached the station, the sky was a deep purple. The huge iron train crept into the snow wind, its hot breath like the breath of a beast. Caleb got out, pulled up his collar, and watched the passengers disembark. Mostly men workers, merchants, a few women with children. He was about to give up when he saw her step out slender, small hat tilted to one side, her long cloak brushing the snow. She looked around, lost in a strange land. Caleb spoke in a low voice. "Miss Hale." The woman turned. Her silver-gray eyes gleamed beneath her veil, both shy and proud. "You are Mr. Rivers." "Yes, ma'am." He took off his hat and bowed slightly. "I've come to take you back to River's Bend." She nodded, saying nothing more. Caleb picked up the old leather suitcase and placed it on the cart. When he reached out, she hesitated for a moment, then placed her small hand on his. Her skin was cold. His was rough, warm and firm. The feeling made her gasp. They sat in the car, the wind blowing. Caleb said in a low voice, "There's a coat on the back of the seat. You should put it on." She started to refuse, but the wind blew past her shoulders, making her shiver. He stopped the car, turned around, and put the coat on her. It was heavy and smelled of leather, smoke, and a man who lived close to nature. "Thanks," she said softly. "You're welcome," he said, and then was silent. They walked through the snow for hours. Sometimes Caleb would ask, "Are you cold?" She would just nod or shake her head. He said nothing more, just pushed the horse faster. Under the light of the oil lamp, the snow fell white, covering their hair and shoulders. As it was getting dark, the glow of a log fire appeared in the distance. "That's River's Bend," Caleb said. "Not big, but warm." When the car stopped in front of the porch, Boone ran out barking happily. Eleanor looked around. The landscape was rough but clean. Smoke from the chimney, yellow light from the windows, a rare sense of peace. Caleb opened the door and said softly, "Come in. Let me light the fire." She walked in and sat by the fireplace. The firelight reflected on her face, her eyes less haughty, only tired and a little warm. Caleb made coffee and handed it to her. "Thank you. I came halfway across the country. I don't know what I'm looking for," Caleb replied, looking at the fire. "Maybe the same thing I'm looking for peace." The wind outside howled like the howling of the wilderness, but inside the house, there was only the crackle of burning wood and steady breathing. She said softly, almost in a whisper, "Don't you ask anything? Don't you ask why I came?" Caleb shook his head. "I used to ask so many questions that no one answered. Now, I've learned to keep quiet." She looked up at him. In the firelight, His face was hard, with deep lines around his eyes, a faint scar on his neck. But there was something in his gaze she had never seen in anyone else, a calmness like a lake in the wind. That night, Eleanor was assigned to the small room behind the kitchen. As she lay down, a breeze blew through the cracks in the door. A horse neighed in the distance, and the warmth of the house filled the air. For the first time in months, she slept soundly. Caleb sat alone on the porch, Boone lying at his feet. He watched the snow fall through the kerosene fire and said softly, "Welcome to the West, Miss Hale. I hope the wind is gentle enough to keep you." The train pulled out of Sage Creek as dusk fell. Thick clouds rolled over the mountains like a gray blanket over the valley. Snow began to fall heavily, white flakes swirling in the air and melting on her cold face. Eleanor sat in the carriage, clutching the edge of Caleb's coat, still surprised by the bitter cold of the West. Caleb rode silently, glancing over at her now and then to make sure she was okay. The wind whipped her bangs out of the brim of her cap, a few strands tangling in his collar, soft as thread connecting two worlds that were once foreign. Boone trotted behind the sled, his feet sinking deep into the snow, but still following faithfully. No one spoke, just the crunch of the sled on the deep snow and the howl of the wind through the ravines. As they passed through the narrow pass, the wind was so strong that Shadow's horse was bucking. Caleb pulled hard on the reins, gave a low shout, and turned to say, "Hold on, Miss Hale, this road isn't as gentle as it is in the East." Eleanor gripped the armrest, her heart racing. For a moment, she saw Caleb's hands rough, with scars along the wrists, but steady and strong. She suddenly realized this man had been through more than words could express. They drove on for another hour or so. Darkness swallowed the landscape. Snow was falling thickly. The road was misty. Caleb stopped the car by a knoll, got out, and looked up at the sky, trying to determine his direction. "We have to take a shortcut through the birch woods," he said shortly, "or we'll be stuck tonight." Eleanor nodded slightly. She didn't protest, just pulled her coat tighter and watched him. As the carriage turned into the woods, the wind died down, but it was so quiet she could hear her heart pounding. The oil lamplight swayed, casting a golden glow on his face, a face so typical of the West, tanned, angular, and brooding. Suddenly, a large branch fell across the road. Caleb jumped down and used an axe to cut the branch. She hurried down to help, but he raised his hand to stop her. "Stay in the car. The wind might blow it down more." "At least I can hold the light for you," Eleanor replied, her voice trembling but firm. He looked up, the light shining in her eyes, paused for a few seconds, then nodded slightly. "Okay, hold the light steady." She held the lantern up, the flickering flame catching the melting snowflakes in his hair. The scent of wood resin, smoke, and snow mingled, creating a strange scent she would never forget. As the last branch was pushed aside, Caleb turned, his smile fleeting like a ray of sunshine in a storm. "Well done. Miss Hale, you have the touch of a mountain man." She laughed, the first time since leaving New York. In her laughter, the ice around them seemed to melt a little. By the time the carriage reached the farmhouse, it was dark. Caleb helped Eleanor down. Her hands were cold, so he took them and rubbed them gently to warm them. "Come in. I'll make a fire." Eleanor stepped into the cabin, the heat from the fireplace stinging her eyes. The space was simple, just a wooden table, a few old bookshelves, and the smell of old smoke. But everything was clean and tidy. On the table was a glass jar containing a few dried, pale purple flowers. She touched them, her heart sinking. "You grow flowers." Caleb hesitated. "They belong to my wife, who passed away." She was silent, not daring to ask more. He turned away and continued to light the fire. A moment later, he brought her a cup of hot coffee and placed it in front of her. "Sugar is in the jar on the left. I'm not sure if it tastes good for city people." She took a sip. The coffee was bitter, but it woke her up. "It's better than I thought," she whispered. Caleb just nodded, saying nothing more. Outside, the wind still howled, but inside the little cabin, the firelight illuminated every detail: the old planks, the rocking chair, the chipped cup, and the shadows of the two figures cast on the wall, closer together than they realized. After a long while, Eleanor put down her cup. "You didn't ask anything about me." Caleb looked up. "I don't need to know your past. We're here to start over. Right." She was silent. The sentence was simple, but it touched the deepest part of her heart. All this time, she had been afraid of being judged, afraid of the past being brought up, but this man didn't need any justification. He asked only one other question, as light as a breeze. "Do you believe in God, Miss Hale?" "I used to," she said, her eyes on the fireplace, "and then I lost it. Where I come from, people use the name of God to cover up cruelty." Caleb nodded slowly, his voice low. "Here, people believe in earth and wind. Maybe it's another way of praying." Silence fell again. Only the crackling of the firewood could be heard. Boone lay curled up beside the stove, his eyes half closed. Eleanor watched the scene, her throat suddenly tight. The air here carried a chill of loneliness, but there was something very real, very human about it. As she stood up to go to her room, Caleb said, "You can rest in the back room. I'll be in the attic. If you need anything, just call." She nodded. "Thank you for taking me in during the storm." He replied shortly, "Not everyone has the courage to go that far. I respect you, Miss Hale." The door closed, but his voice echoed in her mind, low and steady. Eleanor sat down on the bed and took off her gloves, her hands shaking, and not just from the cold. She could feel it. Something was changing, as slight as a breath, but unstoppable. That night, it snowed all night long. In her dream, she saw herself standing in a white field, and Caleb came up to her, held out his calloused hand, and said in a very low voice, "Don't be afraid. Silence is also a way of speaking here." The next morning, when Eleanor opened her eyes, the first light of dawn filtered through the small window, reflecting off the wooden walls. She heard Caleb outside, calling his horse, Boone barking, the sound of shovels hitting the snow. Every sound was strangely real and peaceful. She knew a new chapter of her life had truly begun. The second morning at River's Bend began with the smell of smoke from the kitchen stove and the sound of boiling water in the kettle. Eleanor woke as a weak light filtered through the coarse curtains onto the dark wood floor. Outside, the snow was still white, but the sounds of saws, horses neighing, and dogs barking made the place feel strangely alive. She walked out into the living room and found Caleb sitting by the fire, carefully tying his whip. He had changed from his wool coat to a brown tweed shirt, the sleeves rolled up to reveal muscular, scarred arms. She looked at him, confused, not sure how to greet him. Boone lay at his master's feet, his tail wagging slightly as if greeting her. "Good morning, Miss Hale," Caleb said, his voice warm. "Hello, sir. Can I help you?" He looked up, his gaze kind, but firm. "If you don't mind, you could try making cookies. I have flour and sugar on the counter." Eleanor looked around the kitchen. It was so simple, she had no idea where to start. In New York, she had never had to do anything but write letters. But she nodded. "I'll try." She began to knead the dough, measuring clumsily, flour all over the table. Caleb stood at the door, not speaking, only glancing over occasionally, as if afraid that saying more would make her lose her composure. After half an hour, the fireplace gave off a strange aroma. When she opened the oven door, half the cookies were burned black, the other half stuck to the tray. She bit her lip. "I'm sorry. I'm not used to it." Caleb shrugged, took one, tapped it lightly, and took a bite. "It's hard as a rock, but it tastes okay. Next time, use less flour." The gentle words made her laugh, the first laugh in this house. After breakfast, Caleb led her to the stables. The sky was ashen, the wind blowing hard. He handed her a wooden shovel. "I'll teach you how to shovel hay. Take it slow." Eleanor did so, clumsily but with effort. Sweat soaked her collar, the cold seeping into her skin. When she almost slipped, Caleb quickly caught her. They stood close together, their breaths mingling in the white mist. She caught a glimpse of his eyes so close that her heart skipped a beat. He quickly let go, whispering, "Be careful." The snow is slippery. That afternoon, they fed the horses together. Caleb told her the names of each one shadow, the most loyal Duchess, the finicky female, and Samson, the strong but lazy cart horse. He spoke slowly, his voice carrying a sad Western rhythm. She listened, sensing the deep loneliness in each of his little stories. That night, by the fire, they sat across from each other. Caleb poured tea. Boone stretched out by the stove, his ears relaxed. "How long have you been alone?" Eleanor asked quietly. "Almost 10 years. He didn't look at her. "After the war, I tried to go east, but it was too noisy. I chose to stay here. And your family." He paused, his eyes on the fire. "They're all gone. My mother died when I was in the army. My wife and little daughter. The plague took them." His voice was hoarse, like wind blowing through a dry forest. Eleanor bowed her head. "I'm sorry." Caleb nodded slightly, then changed the subject. "And you? Do you have family in New York?" "Yes, but no one to remember." She smiled faintly. "People only remember me when they need a joke." He looked at her longer than usual. "Here, no one laughs at anyone. It's just the wind and the earth. They keep all the secrets." Night fell, the sky bright with snow reflecting the moonlight. Eleanor stepped out onto the porch and took a deep breath of the cold air. Inside, Caleb sat on a wooden chair, quietly reading a few lines from an old Bible. She heard his voice, low, slow, steady, like a lullaby. When he finished, she asked, "Do you really believe that God still hears us?" Caleb closed the book, thought, and said, "I don't know. But reading those lines reminded me that I was still a part of me." That sentence made Eleanor silent for a long time. Something inside her softened, an old wound touched by a warm hand. The next day, the sky was clearer. The sun was up, melting the snow into shimmering streaks. Caleb took her to the edge of the forest and showed her how to chop wood. She was clumsy, and a piece of wood flew out, almost hitting her foot. He stepped forward, gently grasping her wrist, adjusting her posture. No strength, just rhythm. When she tried again, the axe blade came down cleanly. He chuckled. "See, this land listens to those who listen." Eleanor smiled back. I will remember. In the evening. She wrote in her diary, I don't know why. But here, silence isn't as scary as before. Maybe it's because of him. Or maybe it's because I'm gradually changing. As she put down her pen, Boone came running over and put his head on her lap. Across the room, Caleb sat by the fire, mending a torn glove. The firelight illuminated his face, tired, somber, but with light in his eyes. She felt herself warm. Before going to bed, Eleanor asked softly, do you ever get lonely? Caleb. He looked up, his gaze softening. Loneliness is an old friend of mine, but now I have Boone, the horses, the land. With you, it should be less so. The remark was not flowery, but it kept her awake all night. The next morning, Caleb called her out onto the porch. The snow's melted. I'll teach you to ride. She rolled her eyes. I've never ridden before. Learn. In the West, you can't get anywhere by walking. She laughed, stepping closer to Shadow. The horse tossed its head, its breath puffing out like smoke. Caleb gently placed his hand on the horse's back. Put your foot here. Hold on. I'll carry you. She did. When he put his hand on her waist to push her into the saddle, her heart skipped a beat. Shadow walked slowly around the yard, his hooves tapping rhythmically. Caleb walked beside him, holding the reins. Let the horse feel you, he said. Don't push it. Just trust it. She whispered, like you trust the wind and the earth. He nodded, yes. As dusk fell, they led the horses back to the stables. She turned to him and whispered, thank you for today. I think I'm beginning to understand why you stay here. Caleb looked at her, a brief, rare smile on his face, because this is where people can be real. She was silent. Outside, the snow began to fall again, as thin as chalk dust. In the dim light, their shadows stretched across the snow, close together, yet at a delicate distance. Neither of them realized that, in that silence, something was growing. Spring came late in the west. The snow melted slowly, and small streams of water trickled through the rocks, forming small streams that sparkled in the sunlight. The ground was damp, and the scent of fresh grass began to drift in the air. For Eleanor, mornings were no longer lonely, but the beginning of a day with work to do, people to talk to, and reasons to smile. Caleb taught her how to tend the vegetable patch behind the house. They dug trenches, planted seeds, and covered them with soil. Boone ran around, getting muddy, and Shadow stood near the fence, chewing grass leisurely. Do you plant anything every year? She asked. Shoveling. Caleb stuck the shovel in, leaning on his hands. Potatoes, corn, some carrots. Last year it was so cold. Everything was ruined. I'll help this year. At least I know the carrots from the weeds. He chuckled a short, genuine, rare laugh. You're making progress. Between work sessions, they spoke little. But the silence was different now, no longer awkward, but companionable. When Caleb carried water, Eleanor followed quietly, carrying a second bucket. When he cut wood, she sat sewing torn sacks. They lived in a simple rhythm, as natural as breathing. One afternoon, Caleb took her to the hill behind the house, where the old wooden tombstones stood. He stood in front of one and took off his hat. This is where my wife and children rest. His voice was hoarse. Eleanor fell silent. She bowed her head and whispered, I'm sorry to remind you. No, he replied, looking away. I haven't forgotten, nor do I want to forget. There are losses that cannot be filled, only lived with. She stood beside him, saying nothing more. In that silence, There was a sympathy that needed no words. As they returned, it was raining lightly. Caleb walked slowly, keeping her close by. The rain dissolved the dust, leaving the air smelling of wet grass. "You know," Eleanor said, "in New York, people hate rain, but here it's beautiful." Caleb nodded, because here, rain is hope. That evening, they sat by the fire, listening to the rain falling on the wooden roof. Eleanor picked up the small book he left on the table, the collected poems of Whitman. She read slowly. "I am large. I contain multitudes." She looked up. "Do you like poetry, Caleb?" He smiled, his eyes warm. "I like things that don't need too much explanation. Like poetry, like people." Eleanor chuckled, then closed the book. "I used to think that Western men only knew guns and alcohol. Maybe many do," he replied. "But alcohol doesn't keep you warm forever. Poetry can." Those words made her look at him longer, seeing in his eyes not only firmness, but also a rare gentleness. In the days that followed, the sun shone steadily, and the grass grew green around the house. Eleanor gradually learned to cook, clean, ride a horse, and even shoot a gun. Caleb patiently taught her, always speaking softly, always letting her choose her own rhythm. He never commanded, only suggested, and always kept a respectful distance. One morning, Henry, the mailman, arrived at the farmhouse. He carried a sealed yellow envelope. Eleanor's hand trembled as she received it. The cover read, "From Whitaker & Co., New York." Caleb glanced at it and asked, "A letter from home?" She nodded. "Probably a response to a manuscript I sent before I left." He nodded and quietly walked back inside, leaving her alone. She opened the letter and read quickly. Her eyes stopped at the last paragraph. "We regret that we must reject your manuscript for the silence of the heart. The subject matter is too somber for our present readers. Although the writing is interesting, we hoped you would submit something more cheerful." Eleanor folded the letter, her eyes stinging. Any hope of recognition had just vanished. In the afternoon, she quietly went to the edge of the forest, sat watching the stream melt snow. Caleb found her there. Didn't ask why, just gave her his jacket. "What's the matter?" "Nothing." She tried to smile. He was silent for a moment, then said, "When people don't understand what you write, it doesn't mean it's worthless. It's just that they've never lived like you." She looked at him, her eyes filled with tears. "You talk as if you know me very well." Caleb smiled lightly. "I don't need to know clearly. I just listen. And you talk a lot with silence." That made her cry for real. Not because of sadness, but because for the first time in her life, someone saw her without the mask, without the pretense. Caleb didn't hold her, didn't comfort her, just stood by. But it was that presence that she needed most. That night, Eleanor placed the letter on the fire. The paper curled up and burned to ashes. She looked at the flames and said softly, "Maybe I should write again, but this time, not for them, for myself." Caleb replied in a low voice, "If you need paper, I have plenty." From that day on, she began to write every night by the light of an oil lamp. She no longer wrote about pain, but about the land, wind, rain, and the quiet of the West. The lines were soft as breath, yet strong as tree roots. Caleb would occasionally read them secretly, then just smiled, not commenting. One evening, while she was writing, he stood on the porch, looking out at the stars. She came up beside him and asked, "Do you think we can really start over?" "I don't think you ever start over," he mused. "You just learn to live with what's left." She nodded, her eyes following the firelight. And sometimes what's left is beautiful enough before going to bed. Eleanor blew out the lamp and looked up at the old wooden ceiling. Outside, the sound of horses neighing and dogs barking echoed in the distance. In the vast land, she suddenly felt strangely peaceful. She didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but at least she was no longer afraid. Summer came, dry and harsh. The earth cracked and the distant fields smoked under the western sun. The wind carried the smell of earth, horsehide, and wood smoke. In River's Bend, the days passed slowly. But something was changing, like warmth seeping through the old cold cracks in the heart. Eleanor had settled into farm life. She rose early with Caleb, fed the horses, watered the vegetables, and recorded her work in an old leather notebook. Whenever she leaned over the well, the sunlight caught her pale blonde hair in the smoky haze. Caleb would stop, stare for a few seconds, then bend back down to his work, pretending not to see. One morning, as they were mending their fences, a horseman came up from afar, Henry carrying a large bag of mail. He raised his hand and smiled broadly. "Letters from town, Mr. Rivers and News, for Miss Hale." Eleanor looked up, wiped her hands, and took the envelope. The rounded writing on the envelope made her frown slightly. From Clarissa Ward, New York. She opened it. The first line made her heart sink. "Dear Eleanor, we know about your flight. The New York papers wrote about it, and everyone is talking about it. I just want you to know they are laughing at you. They say you ran away because you were ashamed, because you failed." She clutched the paper, her lip trembling. Caleb sensed something was wrong. He leaned closer and asked softly, "Bad news?" She folded the letter, her voice choking. "No, just a reminder that I was a laughingstock." He looked at her for a long time, then said, "Here, no one cares who you were. In the West, the past is on the horse's back." She looked up, tears glistening in her eyes. "That's easy for you to say, but the wound isn't on the back, it's in the heart." Caleb was silent. Then he nodded, his voice low. "Yes, but the heart can also be a place to start over." That afternoon, Eleanor went to the riverbank alone. She took the letter, read it word by word, then tore it into pieces and dropped it into the water. The white piece of paper floated slowly and disappeared. The cold water splashed on her hand, but her heart felt lighter. Behind her, Caleb stood still, not moving forward, just looking at her. He knew that sometimes people need solitude to heal their own wounds. At night, the wind blew through the roof, carrying the smell of rain. Eleanor sat at the table, continuing her new novel. She wrote about a woman who went west, carrying a heavy past, and the silent man who helped her find her voice again. Caleb sat on the porch, fixing the saddle of his horse. The sound of her pen mixed with the sound of his leather carving knife, a quiet harmony of life. A few days later, a group of strangers stopped by the farm. 3 men on horseback, their coats covered in dust. The leader, Mason Cutter, owner of a large farm in the neighboring county, called out, "Rivers, I hear you're getting a bride from the east." Caleb frowned. "She is my guest. No joke." Mason smiled faintly. "Just wanted to make sure. In this area, women like that are rare. Be careful. She might be no different from those sad story sellers in the city." Before Caleb could speak, Eleanor stepped out. Standing tall in the sunlight, she looked Mason straight in the eye. "If you're looking for someone to laugh at, you should probably look in the mirror. In my town, a man who behaves like you is called rude." Mason laughed, then gave a mock bow. You're sharp. Good luck making it through the winter." As they left, Caleb looked at Eleanor, his eyes a mixture of pride and worry. "You don't have to confront them," he said. Eleanor replied softly. "If I stay quiet, they'll think I'm weak. I've been quiet too long. Caleb." That night, he sat on the porch, smoking. Eleanor sat next to him, silent for a moment, then said, "They hate strong women, don't they?" "Not really. They're just scared. Afraid of what? That you make them realize how small they are." They both laughed. It was a tired but genuine laugh. Then silence. Crickets chirped. The wind carried the smell of hay into the porch. A week later, Henry came back. He brought a telegram. "Congratulations. Your manuscript has been selected for Frontier Voice. It will be published next month." Eleanor read it over and over again, in disbelief. Caleb looked at her, his lips curling slightly. "See, they're starting to listen." She laughed, tears streaming down her cheeks. "But the first person to listen to me was you." That night, they celebrated with last year's cider Caleb had made. Boone lay under the table, and Shadow neighed in the yard. Eleanor sat by the stove, her cheeks rosy from the wine. "Do you think people will like my writing?" Caleb replied. "If they listen, they will. And if they don't, you have me." The words seemed so casual, but they made her heart clench. After that night, she began to notice that every time he entered the room, the air seemed warmer. Every time he spoke, even if it was a short sentence, her heart felt calmer, but she didn't dare say it out loud. She knew too well that a broken heart wouldn't dare to love again. One afternoon, when it suddenly started to rain heavily, Caleb was out in the fields. Eleanor rushed out, pulled her cloak, and shouted, "You'll get wet. Come inside." He laughed, the rain drenching his hair. "I'm used to it. Rain helps the earth breathe, but you're not earth." He looked at her, his eyes so warm that she had to turn away. "Are you worried about me?" She blushed. "I just don't want to have to cook medicine for you." He chuckled. "Thanks, but it's good to be worried." They stood under the porch, the rain pouring down. Her hand brushed his, just for a moment, but it was enough to silence them both. Caleb started to say something, but all he said was, "Maybe I should make another pot of tea." She smiled, her voice shaking. "I will." That evening, when the rain had stopped, Eleanor sat down to write again. The words poured out like water after a dam had broken. She wrote, "Love doesn't need words. It just needs someone to stand in the rain with you." On the porch, Caleb looked up at the starry sky, breathing slowly and deeply. He knew this summer would be unlike any other, and inside him, the small seed he had tried to bury for so long had sprouted. August came. The scorching sun gradually softened. The wind carried the scent of ripe rice and the chirping of insects across the fields. Eleanor began to get used to the quiet of the West, where people did not need to say much, just looked at each other to understand each other. But peaceful life rarely lasted. In this land, rumors spread faster than the wind. One morning, Caleb stopped in town to buy salt and new harness. When he entered Mrs. Mathers's grocery store, all eyes were on him. Several men standing by the bar lowered their voices. "They say that city girl isn't really his bride." "Yes, they say she was sent here to tease him. A joke from the East." Caleb stopped. He put his bag on the counter and said, low and firm, "If you have any questions, just ask me." No one answered, only a low, cold laugh. Caleb turned and walked away, but his heart was in turmoil. He didn't want to believe it, but the seed of doubt had been planted, and he knew it would sprout in his heart if left unaddressed. When he arrived at the farmhouse, Eleanor was reading the first edition of her short story, The Silence of the Plains. Her face was so bright that he had to stop for a few seconds before entering. "Caleb, it's printed. They sent me a special edition. Check it out." He smiled, trying to hide the confusion in his eyes. "Congratulations. Eleanor, you did it." She looked at him, noticing the coldness in his voice. "What's wrong?" "No, just tired." He turned away, hung up his hat, and walked out to the stables. Eleanor stood still. She felt something had changed, but she didn't know why. Caleb had become quieter since that day. Avoiding eye contact, he continued working as usual, but the invisible distance between them had grown more apparent. Boone seemed to sense it too, lingering around her more. One evening, as she brought tea out onto the porch, Caleb sat there chipping wood, the firelight illuminating his face. "Caleb, are you avoiding me?" He paused, his voice low. "They say you were sent here as a joke. Is that true?" The air froze. Eleanor felt as if someone were squeezing her chest. "Who told you?" "It doesn't matter who told you. I just want to hear it from you." She stood there, her hands shaking, her eyes filling with tears. "Yes, at first, but I didn't know. I didn't agree with them. I just had nowhere else to go." Caleb was silent for a long time, then put the knife down. "Why didn't you say so from the beginning?" "Because I was afraid you would despise me. And I thought, if I tried hard enough, the past wouldn't matter." He looked at her, his eyes a mix of hurt and disappointment. "I'm not mad at you for who you were, Eleanor. I'm mad that you didn't trust me enough to tell me the truth." She burst into tears. "I'm sorry. I just want to start over. Just this once." But he was already turning away. That night, Eleanor did not sleep. She heard the horses whinnying outside the stables, Caleb's footsteps coming and going, then silence. In the morning, he had left early with Shadow, without leaving a note. The day passed slowly. Boone lay on the porch, his head propped up on her leg, as if sensing the emptiness in her master's heart. She wrote a few short lines in her diary. "Maybe I was wrong. I thought I could hide the past with good deeds in the present, but it turns out silence can also be a lie." That afternoon, Henry brought news from town. Caleb went to help Mason clear the woods after the fire. He said he might not be back for a few days. Eleanor nodded, fighting back tears. "Thank you, Henry." 3 days later, a sandstorm hit. The wind whistled through the roof, and sand blurred the view. Eleanor tied up the doors, gathered wood, and lit a fire. She looked out the window, only to see nothing. Fear crept in. Caleb still hadn't returned. That night, the wind pounded against the walls like a knock on a door. Boone howled, her chest tightening. She pulled on her coat, grabbed the oil lamp, and stepped out onto the porch. In the misty sandstorm, she heard the distant sound of horses. Then a figure emerged from the storm. "Caleb?" She ran over and helped him lead Shadow into the barn. His shirt was torn, his face black with dust. "What brings you back at this hour?" "The storm changed course. I couldn't stay. Mason lost the cows, and I was almost stranded at the edge of the woods." When he entered the house, he was coughing, his shoulders shaking with cold. Eleanor made him a hot drink and forced him to sit down. "You need to rest. Caleb, you're going to get sick." He smiled faintly. "I'm fine." "Don't worry. You always say that." She handed him the cup of tea. Her voice choked. "I know I did wrong, but please don't torture yourself just to avoid me." Caleb looked at her for a long time, his eyes softening. "Eleanor, I'm not mad at you anymore. I just don't know how to face this. You make me feel alive again, and that scares me," she said softly. "I'm scared too, but maybe sometimes fear is a sign of the truth." The wind outside died down. In the small room, only the crackling of the fire and his labored breathing remained. Eleanor placed her hands on the table, waiting for him to say more. But he was already asleep, his head tilted to the chair. She gently pulled the blanket over him, sat down beside him, and watched his face in the firelight. The old scar on his cheek no longer looked fierce, but like the mark of a man who had lived too much loss. "I didn't come here to laugh at you, Caleb," she whispered, her voice trembling but firm. "I came here to find myself, and maybe I found it." That night, the wind died down, the sandstorm stopped, and for the first time in months she slept soundly. The morning after the dust storm, River's Bend Ranch was strangely quiet. The wind was calm, the sky was clean. The first rays of sunlight filtered through the yellow dust like warm silk. The ranch was bathed in a new light, clear, peaceful, but also fragile like an unfinished dream. Eleanor woke up, her throat dry, her hand still resting loosely on Caleb's arm, the man who had fallen asleep by the fireplace the night before. He slept peacefully, his breathing even, his face strangely relaxed, the light shining through the window, illuminating his gray-brown hair with a few silver strands. In that moment, she realized there are people who don't need to say much. Just by being present, they can make the world more peaceful. She stood up gently, covered him with the blanket, and stepped outside. The smell of damp earth after the rain filled the air. The sky was a pale pink at the foot of the hill, and the sparrows were chirping. She took a deep breath, feeling as if she had just stepped into another world, where the past had begun to melt away, giving way to something gentler. In the barn, Boone was awake, wagging his tail happily. Shadow shook his mane and sneezed. Eleanor got a bucket of water, began her routine, and prepared breakfast. As she put the kettle on the stove, Caleb appeared at the door, his hair disheveled and his shirt still dusty. "You're up too early. Couldn't sleep. I thought you'd need some hot tea." He nodded, sat down at the table, his eyes lingering on her hand as she poured the tea, delicate, gentle, no longer clumsy as in the early days. They sat in silence for a moment, the only sound being the wind blowing through the crack in the door. Then Caleb said, his voice low and sincere, "Thank you, Eleanor. If you hadn't come to pick me up last night, I wouldn't have made it home." She smiled, her eyes distant. "Maybe I need a storm to know who I'm afraid of losing." He looked up. The words made his heart stop. But he didn't say anything more, just nodded, his eyes softening like water melting on snow. In the days that followed, they worked together to clean up the storm-torn farm. Fences were broken, stables partially collapsed, and porches were tilted. Eleanor worked tirelessly, her small hands calloused, but she did not complain. Caleb watched her with a deep respect. This woman, once sent away as a joke, had become the spirit of the place. One afternoon, they sat by the newly built fence. The red sunset from the west illuminated her face, making her hair shine like honey. Caleb was silent for a long time before he said, "You know, I used to think of storms as enemies, but maybe they just come to teach you how to start over." Eleanor chuckled. And sometimes storms also teach you who will hold your hand when the wind blows. They looked at each other longer than usual, deeper than usual. Neither said anything more, but they both knew what they felt went beyond gratitude or friendship. It was something insidious, slow, but so real it made people afraid to touch it. That night, Eleanor wrote another chapter to her story. She wrote, "Some storms come only to clear the dust from the heart. After they pass, people see each other more clearly." As she put down her pen, Caleb walked in, carrying the scent of the night wind and freshly sawed wood. He stopped by the door, looking at the paper on the table. "Your writing is beautiful." She looked up, smiling. "Thank you, but I think I was just writing what I saw. See what you—" The answer made the air pause. Caleb stepped closer, stopping a few steps away from her. In the yellow light, his eyes seemed to contain a fire he had tried to hide for so many years. "Eleanor," he said slowly, "I forgot this feeling a long time ago, the feeling of wanting to keep someone by my side." She looked at him, her lips trembling. "I used to be afraid of this feeling too, but maybe we have both gone too far to turn back." Caleb leaned down, his hand gently touching hers. The touch was light, but full of promise. The warmth spread, not rushed, not fierce, just an acknowledgement that they were no longer hiding. Outside, the wind rustled through the birch trees, making a sound like a whisper of the earth and sky. The next day, Henry brought word that Eleanor's writing was being well received. The frontier voice called her the storyteller of the wilderness, a rare woman who dared to write about loneliness and courage. The whole town began to talk of Eleanor of River's Bend. But with fame came new rumors. Some were jealous, saying she was only successful because of the old veteran's pity. When Caleb heard the news at the market, he said nothing. He just silently tightened his saddle strap. On the way home, he kept thinking, would their love, once exposed to the light, become a laughingstock again, like before? At night, Eleanor noticed that he was unusually quiet. She asked, "What's wrong, Caleb?" He sighed. "I don't want you to be hurt by staying here. You can go back to the city, continue writing, be recognized. As for me, I'm just a man with a barren land." She stepped forward, her eyes sparkling. "Do you know why I can write, Caleb? Because here, I'm no longer afraid of being small. It's this place, and you, that gives me the courage to tell," he said softly. "Eleanor, don't make me leave. I've lived in a crowd and still been lonely. But here, just hearing the wind through the window, I know I belong." Caleb looked at her for a long moment, then nodded slightly. "If you're sure, then I won't stop you. It's not that I'm sure, it's that I choose." That night, when she stepped out onto the porch, the sky was filled with stars. She stood there, listening to the horses pawing, Boone barking softly, and felt life regenerating around her. In her heart, the fear faded. She knew, whatever the future held, she had found something she had never had in her entire life, a place she could truly call home. The early autumn days in the West always have a quiet beauty that can easily shake the heart. The wind is calmer, the sun is soft and golden, and the afternoons are long with the scent of hay spreading throughout the valley. River's Bend is now like a peaceful picture. But for Eleanor, that peace is no longer simply a scene. It is a breath, a rhythm of life, a place that touches the deepest part of her heart. She still wrote regularly, sometimes sitting by the window, sometimes on the porch, sometimes in the meadow, with the small notebook on her knees. Caleb never asked what she was writing, but every time he passed by, he would stop for a few seconds, just to watch her tilt her head, her hair flowing in the wind, her eyes focused on the page. He didn't need to read to understand, because he knew she was writing from the heart. One morning, Henry Boyd brought a fresh envelope. The ink was still fresh. The seal was deep red, and on the cover was the familiar signature, Whitaker & Co. Publishers, New York. More good news for you. Miss Hale? Henry smiled. Eleanor took the letter, both excited and worried. Caleb stood near the fence, trying to appear calm, but his eyes followed her every move. She opened the letter. The first line made her hand stop. We congratulate you. The Silence of the Plains has been nominated for this year's Western Literary Award. The editors would like you to be in New York to accept the award and for an interview in Harper's Weekly. Henry exclaimed. That's great news. Miss Hale, you'll be famous all over the country. Eleanor smiled, but the smile was fleeting. She glanced at Caleb, who stood still, clutching the brim of his hat. When Henry left, there was silence. Eleanor held the letter, looking out at the meadow. What do you think, Caleb? He took a moment to answer. I think you should go. This is the opportunity you've been waiting for all your life, she said softly. And you, he avoided her eyes. I have nothing to do with it. I'm just a groom. His voice was so cold that she had to squeeze the letter tighter. You're not just anyone, he replied, still not turning around. You were born for another world. I knew it the moment you got off the train. Don't let this land hold you back. That evening, Eleanor sat alone by the fireplace. The flames cast a red glow on the letter on the table. Outside, the early autumn wind blew across the roof. She opened her diary and wrote, I used to think I wanted to be seen. But now, I'm scared. If I go back, will I still be the person Caleb knows? When Caleb entered, she quickly closed the notebook. He sat down on the chair opposite, silent for a long time. You're leaving tomorrow, right? Maybe. Her voice was small and hesitant, but I'm not sure yet. He looked at her, his eyes hiding something too big to name. If you go, remember, don't let anyone make you ashamed of loving this place. And if I don't go, she asked. Caleb pursed his lips and sighed. Then I'm afraid I'll never let you go again. The two of them looked at each other, the firelight flickering on their faces. Eleanor wanted to say something, but the words caught in her throat. She only knew that if she left, she would lose more than the land. She would lose the only peace she had ever found. That night, she did not sleep. She sat down and wrote a letter back to New York, her hand trembling slightly. The letter was not a rejection, but a report of her heart. I am grateful for this opportunity, but right now, I cannot leave the land that inspired me to write every word of this story, because here, I am no longer a writer. I am a human being. The next morning, Caleb woke early. He found her packing in the kitchen. On the table was a sealed letter addressed to the publisher. He understood without asking. Are you sure? Sure, she said softly, but her eyes were shining with tears. I choose to stay. Caleb looked at her for a long time. Then he spoke slowly, his voice low and trembling like the wind. Well, Eleanor Hale, welcome home. The next few days were a comfortable silence. No one mentioned New York again. Eleanor continued writing, while Caleb repaired the stables, added fences, and prepared for winter. Each evening, they sat by the fire, listening to the crackling of the wood, the wind blowing through the chimney, and Boone breathing softly under the table. One day, Caleb brought out a small walnut box and placed it on the table. "This was my wife's. She's had it since we were married. I thought you should have it." Eleanor opened the box. Inside was a silver ring, engraved with a wild rose. She looked up, surprised. "Caleb, I can't accept. It's not a wedding ring. It's just a keepsake. I want you to know that sometimes the past isn't just for forgetting. It's to let you know you can still love." She was silent, then nodded slightly. "I understand. Don't let it be a burden. Keep it if you want, or throw it in the river. But don't be afraid of love anymore." That night, Eleanor sat on the porch. The moonlight bathed the valley, reflecting off the ring on her finger. She turned it between her fingers, then slipped it on, not as a promise, but as a marker of her own journey, from someone sent away as a joke to someone who dared to choose. Caleb came out, put on his cloak, and sat beside her. "You know," he said softly, "I never thought I would see the moon so beautiful again." Eleanor smiled. "Maybe because this time you weren't looking at it alone." The wind blew, light as a breath. Somewhere, a coyote squealed. Boone curled at their feet. Shadow pawed the ground, then lay down. All was quiet. In the moonlight, Caleb turned and slowly took her hand. It was calloused, warm, and strong. She let it rest, not pulling away. Their eyes met no words needed, just the understanding that they had both been alone enough to appreciate this presence. In the east, dawn had not yet come, but in their hearts, light had begun to rise. The winter wind began to blow across Saddleback Ridge, bringing a chill that slowed everything down except time. Snow blanketed the wide fields. Across the barn roof and the old wooden steps of Rivers Bend Ranch's front porch, in the quiet of the west, the sound of wood burning in the fireplace sounded like a reminder of the past. Eleanor Hale donned a thick sweater and a fleece scarf Caleb Rivers had given her and headed out to gather firewood. Boone trailed behind, leaving small footprints in the snow. Every time she stepped outside, the cold air stung her face, but her heart felt the warmth of a life she thought she would never have. Caleb was mending the south fence, where the snow had broken some of the slats. He worked carefully, saying little, but whenever Eleanor brought him hot tea, he smiled, his eyes softer than the winter sun. Words were scarce between them now. They understood each other with every look, every breath. One afternoon, as the sun was just a faint streak of light over the mountains, Caleb spoke up. "Eleanor, do you miss New York?" She paused. "Sometimes, but missing doesn't mean wanting to go back. Aren't you afraid of being forgotten? You were a writer read all over the city." Eleanor looked away, her voice soft but firm. "If I write to be remembered, then every word I say is a lie. I write because I want to understand myself. And here, I have done that." Caleb fell silent, a faint smile playing on his lips. He wasn't an emotional man, but there was something in her voice that made his heart flutter, an emotion that had been dormant for too long, now awakened by the cold western wind. Night fell quickly. They sat by the fire, with Boone and Shadow. Outside, the snow was falling heavily, muffling all sound. Eleanor poured more cider into Caleb's glass. "You were afraid of the snow?" she asked. He smiled. "I was afraid of the silence of the snow. It reminded me of what I had lost. And now I think. The snow is just the world's way of making you stop and listen." She smiled, placing her hand on his. And what are you listening to? Caleb? He looked at her, his eyes as deep as the night outside. The sound of someone makes me not feel alone anymore. She fell silent, letting the warmth spread between them. The whistling wind outside made the interior feel even more familiar. She leaned her head against his shoulder. For the first time, Caleb didn't pull away. He let her be, their breaths mingling, like two heartbeats finding the same silence. The next day, they woke early. There were wolf tracks in the snow from the night before. Caleb shouldered his gun and was about to check around the camp, but Eleanor stopped him. "Don't go too far. I'm worried." He smiled. "Have you forgotten I've lived in this area all my life? Wolves come and go. But some things, once they're gone, they don't come back," she whispered, her eyes shining with genuine worry. Caleb paused, then nodded slightly. "Okay, I promise." That afternoon, when he returned, the snow had fallen harder. Eleanor waited on the porch, an oil lamp in her hand. Seeing him from a distance, she walked down the steps, smiling slightly. "You see, I told you. The wolf was just an excuse to go see the snow." Caleb laughed, brushing the snow off his hat. "Maybe, but if you hadn't waited for me, I would have lost my way back." The words made Eleanor freeze. She didn't know what he meant, or if it was just a Western joke, but inside, her heart was beating fast like the first time she saw him. One evening, as the snow lay thick outside, they sat rereading Eleanor's first post. She read slowly, her voice trembling slightly. "I came to the West as a fugitive, but what I thought was the end of the road turned out to be the beginning. Here, I learned to listen to silence and realized silence also has the language of love," Caleb said softly. "You know, I used to think silence was a punishment, but you made me believe that sometimes silence is the way to keep the most precious things." "Keep what?" "Caleb. Someone I dare not lose." Eleanor bowed her head, tears falling without her realizing it. She held his hand and squeezed it gently. In the small room, there was no longer any distance. There were no confessions, no kisses, just two people who understood each other so well that no words needed to be said. The days that followed passed slowly as winter passed. Together they shoveled snow, repaired the barn, lit the fire, made soup. Sometimes Caleb told her about his dead wife, about the war, about the years he thought he had turned to stone. Eleanor listened, without judgment, without interrupting, just silently letting him talk. One evening, as the fire was dying down, he whispered, "Eleanor, I thought I had nothing left to give, but you made me realize that I still have a heart that can warm up." She smiled, placing her hand on his chest. "It never cools down. You just forgot how to feel it." He replied, "And you reminded me." Outside, the snow had stopped falling. A cold moon shone down from the sky, reflecting off the white. The farm was bathed in a soft, peaceful light. Boone curled up in the kitchen, shadow hooves tapping in the barn, as if all nature were asleep. Eleanor looked up at him, her voice as light as a breath. "Caleb, do you believe that we met by fate?" He smiled, his eyes shining. "I don't believe in fate, but I believe that there are people who, no matter how far they stray, will find their way back to the same sky, and that's us, maybe so." At that moment, no more words were needed. Outside, the snow was still falling, but in their hearts, winter had turned into spring. Winter finally receded from River's Bend like a weary traveler. The snow melted slowly, revealing patches of brown earth, and the first blades of grass emerged from beneath the ice, The steady drip of water from the eaves, combined with the neighing of horses outside, signaled that spring had truly arrived. Eleanor Hale stood by the window, a cup of hot tea in her hand, her gaze fixed on the distant hills where they began to change color. She had never thought she would stay here for so long. A year. Only a year. But to her, it felt like a lifetime, because each day here made her a different person, stronger, calmer, and more thoughtful. Caleb Rivers walked in, wood dust on his shoulders. He had just finished repairing the barn after a long winter, and the smell of pine resin still lingered on his clothes. He looked at her and smiled. "It's beautiful, isn't it? The way the earth comes back to life." She nodded. "I always thought only humans could be reborn after loss. But it turns out nature can do it, too, even more beautifully." Caleb put down the saw and slowly approached her. "Sometimes we just have to wait long enough. Every winter ends. Eleanor." She looked at him and smiled. "Like human pain. Yeah, but we just don't know when it will." There was a moment of silence. The fire crackled in the hearth, and warmth spread throughout the little cabin. Everything seemed to be emerging from the shadows of the past. But life, Eleanor had learned, never leaves people alone for long. That afternoon, Henry Boyd brought news again. He carried a telegram, and his expression was strange. "From New York, Miss Hale," he said, placing the small piece of paper on the table. "From Margaret Whitmore." Eleanor paused. The name made her feel as if someone had touched an old scar. Her mother, the one who had sent her away like a commodity, like a cruel joke. She took the telegram and read it slowly. "Your father is seriously ill. Come home now if you still consider yourself family." The air in the room seemed to freeze. Henry looked at her with pity and then quietly left. Caleb stood still, not saying a word. Eleanor still sat there, her hands clutching the piece of paper, her eyes blank. "You have to go," Caleb said softly after a long moment. "Don't you? After all they've done, he's still your father. Eleanor, there are things you can't face that haunt you for the rest of your life." She looked at him, her eyes glistening with tears. "What about you? What will happen to you if I go?" Caleb pursed his lips and looked at the floor. "I'll wait, but don't let them make you forget who you are." That night, Eleanor did not sleep. She walked out onto the porch and looked up at the starry sky. Each star was a memory, and among the thousands of memories, the image of Caleb was the only one that made her feel at peace. But she knew that there were journeys one must take alone. The next morning she packed a few things. Caleb helped her load them into the carriage. As she climbed in, he said, "It's a long way back to New York. If you're tired, remember that River's Bend is still here, and Boone will be waiting for the sound of your carriage coming back." She smiled, trying to hide her tears. "Will he wait too? Do you doubt it?" The carriage rolled away, leaving behind it the faint sound of hoofbeats, and the man stood still, watching it, his hand clutching his hat, his eyes fixed on it, until it was out of sight around the hill. The train ride from Wyoming to New York took 3 days. Eleanor sat by the window, watching the landscape pass by, the mountains receding, then the fields, then the cities rising. Each scene felt like a piece of an old life closing. When the train pulled into Grand Central Station, New York greeted her with heavy humidity and bustling noise. She was almost overwhelmed. Everything felt foreign, even though she had lived here before. The old house on Fifth Avenue still stood there, as cold and majestic as before. The butler opened the door and bowed. "Miss Hale, the mistress is waiting." She entered. The smell of rosewater was strong. The red carpet was long. Everything was magnificent and emotionless. Mrs. Margaret Whitmore was still sitting in the same place, straight, her hair tied up, her eyes cold. "You're back at last," she said, her voice devoid of emotion. "Your father is in the room above." Eleanor walked down the long hallway and pushed open the oak door. Her father was noticeably thinner, his face haggard, but his eyes were gentler than ever. He tried to smile when he saw her. "Eleanor, my daughter." She knelt by the bed and took his limp hand. "I am here. Father, I am sorry," she choked. "You don't have to." "No, let me finish. I let your mother do what I couldn't stop. I know you are no laughing matter. You are a pride I don't deserve." Tears welled up in her father's hand. She held it tightly and whispered, "I forgive you. Father, it's over." 3 days later, he died in his sleep, peacefully, like someone who had found something unfinished. The funeral was small. Few people came, but the emptiness in Eleanor's heart was so great that it made it hard for her to breathe. After the funeral, Margaret came to her, her eyes still cold as glass. "What are you going to do now?" "Stay here." Eleanor looked straight at her mother. "No, I don't belong here anymore." "So you choose a crippled cowboy over fame. You've ruined yourself." She smiled, softly but firmly. "No, Mother, I found myself, and if you ever loved me, let me live as I want." Margaret turned away, saying nothing more. Perhaps she did not understand, or did not want to understand. But Eleanor knew, this time, she did not need anyone's approval. A week later, she boarded the train back west. As the train crossed the Wyoming border, she felt a weight lift in her heart. Caleb appeared clearly in her mind, standing in the snowy field, his eyes distant and patient, like someone who still believed in promises. When she reached Willow Creek Station, dusk had already bathed the valley in gold. Boone was the first to spot her. The dog burst out of its kennel, barking loudly. The sound made Caleb look up. He had been standing there fixing his horse, and when he saw her step from the carriage, he could hardly believe his eyes. "Eleanor." She smiled, her eyes filled with tears. "I told you. Oh, we'll come back." He walked over, standing in front of her, his eyes sparkling in the evening light. "I was afraid you would no longer remember this road. How could I forget this is where I started again?" They stood there, in the sunset, in the sound of the wind blowing through the grass, without needing to say anything more, because sometimes returning is the most complete answer to love. That evening, by the fire, Eleanor told Caleb about her father, her late apology, and her choice to forgive. He listened without interrupting, nodding occasionally. When he held my hand, "I realized," she said, "that hatred only makes people lose themselves. Forgiveness is not because they deserve it, but because I deserve peace." Caleb looked at her, his eyes deep. "You have come a long way, Eleanor, and I think you have become the person you were looking for." She smiled softly, her voice trembling slightly. "And you, Caleb, have you ever thought about forgiving yourself?" He was silent. The fire reflected in his eyes, warm and painful. "Maybe. I need someone to remind me of that every day." "Then let me be that person." The words were as light as a spring breeze, but carried the weight of a true promise. Caleb leaned down and took her hand. "Are you sure?" "More sure than anything." Outside, frogs croaked by the stream. and the scent of damp earth filled the house. Spring had come, not only on the land, but also in the hearts of two people who had thought they had ended their love that night under the starry western sky. Caleb sat beside Eleanor, both silent. But in that silence, 1,000 things were said without words: loss, fear, gratitude, and love. Rivers Bend Ranch is now more than just a ranch in the middle of the prairie. It's the beginning of a journey where two once broken souls found each other amidst the solitude and wind. Summer in the Rivers Bend Valley arrives with sudden showers, then leaves as if it were never there. Big skies drag gray clouds across Saddleback Ridge, and the wind carries the scent of burnt grass and wet earth. It's a season of life, of trees coming back to life, and of stories finding warm endings. After returning, Eleanor Hale was no longer the timid woman who had stepped off the train a year earlier. She was now confident, steady, and her eyes carried the calm of someone who had weathered a storm. Life on the farm returned to a familiar rhythm. She rode in the morning, helped Caleb check on the horses in the afternoon, and sat with him in the evening, reading letters from friends or the news from town. One morning, as the sun streamed through the wooden window, Caleb brought home an envelope. The cover read, Harper's Weekly, New York. Eleanor opened it. The first line made her smile. Her manuscript. The Quiet Man of Rivers Bend was selected for a special issue on the West. Readers wanted to know who the real man behind the story was. She looked up at Caleb, her eyes a mixture of emotion and shyness. What would he say if he knew he had become a literary character? Caleb smiled, his eyes shining with familiar calm. I would say they wrote it wrong. I am no hero, but you are the one who helped me find myself again. And you, Eleanor, he said slowly, are the one who made this place smile again. They laughed together, their laughter echoing through the wooden house, as light as a summer breeze blowing across the fields. But life, even when it was easy, still had unexpected challenges. That July, a drought set in. It hadn't rained in 4 weeks. The land was parched. The rivers were dry. The grass was yellow. Caleb and a few neighbors had to share buckets of water to keep their livestock alive. One evening, as the wind rose from the west, an unusual smell of smoke filled the air. Caleb stepped out onto the porch and looked up far away. At the foot of the mountain, a red light flickered like a ghost fire. Eleanor, he called urgently, a forest fire. Within hours, the flames spread faster than the wind. The valley rang with screams, neighing horses, and clanking metal. Caleb and the other men hauled water and chopped down trees to create fire breaks. Eleanor helped move valuables and lead the horses out of the stables. Boone barked loudly, and Shadow stamped his hooves anxiously. Thick smoke filled the area. As the flames approached the main house, Eleanor ran out, grabbing Caleb's hand. We have to leave now. I have to hold that shallow river. If it burns through, the whole farm will be lost, Caleb. You can't do it alone. He interrupted, his eyes determined. Eleanor, listen to me. Take Boone, Shadow, and the papers and leave. I promise to follow. She looked at him and saw in his eyes a different fire. Not the fire of destruction, but the fire of responsibility, of someone who had lost everything and did not want to lose more. She nodded, though her heart was aching. Promise me you'll come back. He smiled, a small, painful smile. Do you think I'd let you wait alone? She turned, leading Boone and Shadow to the safety of the field. But as she reached it, she looked back, fire leaping up, swallowing the barn roof. Caleb was nowhere to be seen. Without thinking, she ran back. Her skirt caught in dry branches, her breathing heavy. "Caleb!" she shouted through the smoke. "Caleb Rivers!" In the red glow. She saw him trying to beat the fire in the hedge behind him. His shirt was singed, his shoulder bleeding. She rushed forward, wrapping her cloak around it and beating the flames. "Eleanor, go no. I won't go while you're here." The wind howled, and smoke swirled. The flames reached the eaves. Eleanor coughed, tears mixing with the stinging smoke. Caleb pulled her down, shielding her with his body. "Get down, crawl with me." They pushed through the rubble and crawled to the low ground near the ditch. Caleb poured water on his shirt and covered her. Fire burned behind them, trees cracking. When they finally emerged from the smoke, they were both exhausted. Eleanor fell, gasping for breath. Caleb collapsed beside her, coughing up blood. She knelt down. Panicked Caleb. "You're hurt." He laughed weakly, his voice hoarse. "It's just a scratch. I promised you. I'm not going anywhere." The rain began to fall. The first drops, heavy and coarse. Then it came down in torrents, drenching them both, extinguishing the ashes, washing away the dust. Eleanor burst into tears, holding him in the rain. "You fool! I've lost enough. Don't make me lose more." Caleb placed his hand on her cheek, his fingers trembling. "You haven't lost anything, Eleanor, because I'm still here." The rain continued all night, and by morning the fires were out. The farmhouse was partially charred, but still standing. As the sun rose, the smell of wet earth and ash mingled into a strange aroma, pungent, heady, but alive. Eleanor tended Caleb's wound, her hands shaking as she bandaged his shoulder. He squinted at her, his voice tinged with amusement. "You know, I think I like the way you command more than the way you beg." She glared at him, but tears were falling. "If you joke again, I'll bandage you until you can't breathe. Then I'll die in the arms of the one I love. It's worth it." The words made her pause. She looked at him, her eyes sparkling. "What did you say?" He breathed out, smiling slowly. "Eleanor Hale, I loved you from the day you stepped off that train. But I was afraid you would leave, afraid my love would be a burden." She bent down, her voice choked. "And I was only afraid of not saying it sooner." They looked at each other, and in that moment, everything around them, the ashes, the burns, the rain, faded into the distance. She touched his lips lightly, a trembling touch, gentle and sure, not a kiss of passion, but of two souls finding their way. Over the next few weeks, life in River's Bend began to recover. Neighbors came to help rebuild the barn and replant the grass. Henry brought a thank you letter from Harper's Weekly, along with the newspaper that had printed Eleanor's story. The front page was headlined, "The Woman Who Wrote Silence and the Man Who Made the West Gentle." Eleanor read the article, then set the paper on the table. "They don't understand," she whispered. "Don't understand what Caleb asked. They think I'm writing about you. But really, I'm writing about us, about how two lost people can find each other in the ashes of their lives." Caleb smiled, his eyes sparkling. "That's fine. Let them think that. As for me, I know the truth. And what is the truth? That I never thought I could love again. Until you came along." She smiled, leaning her head on his shoulder. Outside, the grass was green again. The wind blew the scent of new earth. Everything was peaceful, simple, and so real that it needed no embellishment. One afternoon, as the sun was setting over the mountains, Eleanor sat down to write the last page of her new novel. She wrote, "We all carry scars. Some hide them. Some let them tell their story. but only when we dare to open them can our scars become the light that guides us home. She put down her pen and looked out the window. Caleb was walking shadow around the fence, Boone running at his heels. The afternoon light washed over them, turning the scene to a golden glow. Eleanor said softly, as if to herself, "Maybe, finally, I'm really back." When autumn comes to River's Bend Ranch, the valley seems to be covered in a golden coat. Leaves from the birch trees fall slowly, swirling in the wind. On dry, sunny days, the distant sound of horse hooves echoes across the meadow, then fades into the sunset, like blue smoke on the roof. Eleanor Hale sat on the porch, a new manuscript on the table. She had just finished her first novel, a novel inspired by River's Bend, a place she had come to as a joke of fate, and now a home she never wanted to leave. On the last page, she wrote, "Love doesn't find perfect people. It finds broken hearts and stays when both are brave enough to try to fix it." Boone lay at her feet, his old head raised as Caleb emerged from the stable. He carried a crumpled letter in his hand, his expression strange. "Eleanor," he said slowly, "here's a letter for you. From New York." She raised her head and took the paper. The handwriting was so delicate, so familiar it made her heart ache. "Margaret Whitmore." Eleanor opened the letter and read in silence. Her mother's words were brief, but different from usual. "My daughter, I don't know how much time I have left. My old illness has returned, and this house is colder than ever. I miss you. If you want to see me again, come back before winter comes." She put the letter down, her heart in turmoil. They had never spoken the truth to each other, never held each other in love. Now, with her mother growing weaker, the past suddenly became a burden. Caleb sat down beside her, his hand gently touching her shoulder. "You have to go," he said softly. Again she said, her voice choking, "I was just starting to feel like I belonged. Sometimes, to truly belong, you have to go back to the place you ran away from." She looked up at him, tears threatening to fall. "If I leave, will you wait for me in the snow like last time?" he smiled, his voice low and steady. "If it snows forever, I will still wait." The next morning, Eleanor packed her things. She kissed Boone on the head, stroked Shadow, and looked at Caleb for a long time. There was no need to say goodbye. Their eyes said it all. New York greeted her with cold winds and gray skies. The house on Fifth Avenue was as elegant as ever, but everything inside was different. Margaret lay in the large bed, her face thin and pale. When she saw her daughter, her eyes flashed with an emotion Eleanor had never seen there, remorse. "You're home," she said softly, her voice shaking. "I thought you wouldn't forgive me." Eleanor stepped forward and took her mother's hand. "I used to think so, but I understand, Mother. Some people only know how to love the way they've been taught, even if it hurts." Margaret burst into tears, a rare drop falling onto her trembling hands. "You were wrong about everything. I'm not a joke. I'm not a commodity. I'm the best thing that ever happened to you." Eleanor bowed her head and hugged her mother. For the first time in their lives, they hugged each other for a long time, not for social reasons, not for formality, simply because they were both tired of hatred. In the days that followed, she stayed home to take care of her mother. At night, she continued writing and realized that her words were now different, gentler, more forgiving. Perhaps forgiveness was the final chapter she owed herself. One morning in early November, Margaret took her hand and said softly, "Eleanor, When I go, don't stay because of duty. Go back to where you laugh. Live for yourself." She nodded, tears welling in her eyes. "I promise." 3 days later, Margaret died in her sleep. No more coldness, only a peaceful face. When the funeral was over, Eleanor stood in front of the house again, watching the red leaves fall all over the steps. She said softly, "I'm home, Mother, and now I'm going to move on." She returned west in early winter. Snow had begun to cover the woods. The air was chilly, but her heart felt strangely warm. When the carriage stopped at River's Bend, Caleb was waiting on the porch, his long coat fluttering in the wind. Boone barked. Shadow whinnied. Eleanor stepped down, her step shaking with emotion. Caleb approached, saying nothing. He just held out his hand, and she put hers in it. A firm, reassuring grip, as if there had never been a parting. "You're back," he said, his voice low and warm. "Home," she replied, smiling. They walked into the house, where the fire was already lit. On the table was the letter from Harper's Weekly again, an invitation for Eleanor to write a regular column on life in the West. She read it, put it down, and looked at Caleb. "They want me to write about a real Western man. I think I know exactly who that is." He chuckled, his smile as gentle as the firelight. "If you're going to shame me in front of the whole country, let me at least choose my best portrait." She laughed. "No, I'll write about the way he lived honest, resilient, and quiet, and how he made the West feel good." Caleb was silent for a moment, then looked at her, his voice low. "Eleanor, there is something I never told you. I lost my first wife in a fire. When you came, I was afraid that if I loved again, fate would take everything away. But you made me believe that sometimes God gives people a second chance." Eleanor held his hand, her voice trembling. "I was also afraid that if I loved, I would lose my freedom. But it turns out, loving the right person is the only way to be free." They sat together for a long time, watching the fire burn in the hearth. Outside, snow began to fall, light, thin, and beautiful as a promise.
A year later, Harper's Weekly published a collection of Eleanor's writings, titled Letters from the Quiet Valley. Her stories of simple life in the West touched readers across America. In her preface, she wrote, "If you ever get lost, know that somewhere there is a land and someone waiting for you to return." On the day the book was released, Eleanor and Caleb went out together to the small town of Willow Creek. As she signed autographs for the first few copies, the bookstore owner asked, "Are you going to write a sequel?" She laughed. "I think sequels are being lived, not written." As they left town, the snow was flying. Caleb helped her onto the horse, then climbed on top. They rode slowly through the valley, where the afternoon light was golden. The wind blew her hair, and she turned to him. "Caleb Rivers, did you ever think we'd make it this far?" "No," he said, keeping his eyes on the road. "But I knew, from the very beginning, that I didn't want this journey to end." She smiled, resting her head on his shoulder. "Then don't let it end." They walked away, their silhouettes melting into the sunset. Behind them, River's Bend. Ranch lay still in the first snow, blue smoke rising from its chimney, a symbol of life, of love reborn. Their story, which began as a cruel joke, has become a little legend of the West. The story of the woman sent to taunt a cowboy, but who finds herself in his heart, and the man who thought he had lost everything, but who finds new life in her eyes. No need for a full ending. Just know that they chose to stay together,
in the wind, in the snow, and in every season of river's bend. The story she was sent west as a mail-order bride to mock him. But the cowboy couldn't let her go is not just about love. It's about the journey of forgiveness, of the courage to be true to your heart. Eleanor and Caleb teach us that people are not defined by their past, but by how they choose to rise from pain. That silence is not weakness, but the strength of forgiveness. And that true love is not about finding the perfect person. It's about finding the person who makes you feel at peace when you're with them. For those who have passed half of their lives, this story is a gentle reminder it is never too late to love, to forgive, and to start over. Thank you for being here, listening and feeling. If the story touches your heart, please like, share, and subscribe to the channel so we can continue together through many more emotional journeys.